She wasn't looking for him. She was looking for the ledger. The study was dark except for the amber spill of a single desk lamp, the kind of light that made secrets look like shadows and shadows look like sins. Amara had counted on 3 minutes. The house was supposed to be empty. Gideon Vale was supposed to be across the city, bleeding someone else dry in a back room that didn't have her name in it. He was not across the city. He was here, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, one hand braced against the mahogany like the desk was the only thing holding the empire upright. A single dark stain bloomed at his cuff. He hadn't noticed her yet. Or he had, and he was simply deciding what to do about it. Then he looked up. The silence lasted exactly long enough to become something else. "You distract me." His voice was low. Controlled. The voice of a man who chose every word the way other men chose weapons. He didn't move. Didn't need to. And in my world, his eyes held hers, steady, dark, terribly honest. "I can't have that." She heard a threat. It wasn't one. "Hello, my beautiful family. I am so glad you chose to be here with me today, truly. Before we go anywhere, I just want to stop for a second and check in with you. How are you doing? How was your day? I hope it was kind to you, and if it wasn't, I hope what we're about to do together makes up for some of that. If this is your very first time here, welcome home. You found us, and we are so happy you did. Go ahead and like and subscribe. It keeps this family growing and it keeps these stories breathing. Drop a hello in the comments too, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's in the room with me. Now, put the day down. Just set it aside for a little while. Get comfortable, grab something warm, and give me your full attention. Because the story we're stepping into today? It starts in a dark study, with a man who controls everything, and a woman who is about to become the one thing he cannot. The Vale estate did not feel like a crime scene. That was the first thing Amara noticed, and the first thing that unsettled her. She had prepared herself for darkness, for heavy curtains drawn against daylight, for the smell of gunpowder and old money gone rotten at the edges. She had prepared herself for the kind of house that confessed what it was. Instead she found high ceilings and morning light, a library that smelled of cedar and leather binding, and a kitchen where a woman named Rosa made coffee so good it felt like an argument against everything Amara had come here to do. She unpacked her grief into a small room on the 3rd floor and told herself it was temporary. Everything about this was temporary. Her name, borrowed. Her references, forged, carefully, by a man who owed her father a debt he could never fully repay. Her uniform, black dress, white apron, the armor of invisibility, pressed and hanging on the back of the door like a costume waiting for its performance. She put it on the first morning with the deliberateness of someone going to war, smoothed the apron flat, and went downstairs to learn the shape of the enemy's life. Gideon Vale, she had been told, was a brute who had learned to dress well. She believed that for approximately 4 days. The first fracture in the story came on a Tuesday. She was dusting the library, actually dusting it, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, had eyes like a surveillance system and Amara could not afford to be noticed for the wrong reasons, when she heard him. Not footsteps. Not a door. A voice, low and even, coming from the adjoining study, reading aloud. She stilled. He was reading poetry. Not performing it. Not dictating it to someone else. Reading it quietly, to himself, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, while somewhere in the city his men were presumably doing the kind of work men in his position paid other men to do. She recognized the cadence before she recognized the poem, Neruda, she thought, though the words were too muffled to be certain. The tone was unmistakable. Something old. Something that had survived its own century and arrived in this study without apology. Amara stood with a duster in her hand and recalibrated everything she thought she knew. By the 3rd day she had mapped the ground floor. By the 5th she had the upper corridor. She moved through the house the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, learning which floorboards announced her, which doors swung silently, which rooms were locked and which were merely closed. His study was always locked when he was away. When he was inside it, the door stayed open. She found that detail strange, and then she found it telling. A man who locked rooms against absence but left them open in his own presence was a man who feared the wrong kind of intrusion. He wasn't guarding against people. He was guarding against time. Against the particular loneliness of returning to a room that had been sitting empty, waiting, holding its breath for you. She did not write that thought down anywhere. She didn't trust herself with it. She saw him properly for the first time on the fourth morning. Not the silhouette in the study. Not the voice through the wall. Him, in the kitchen doorway at 6:15, before the rest of the house had stirred, in a white shirt with the collar open and his hair not yet ordered into the severity it wore by daylight. He was holding a cup of coffee with both hands the way people do when they're cold or tired or thinking about something they haven't solved yet. He didn't see her at first. She was at the far counter, already into her first task of the day, and for a moment she had the strange privilege of watching Gideon Vale when he thought he was alone. He looked, she thought, like a man carrying something very heavy a very long way. Then he saw her, and the expression shuddered, not unkindly, but completely, and he became the other version of himself. Composed. Distant. The kind of still that costs something to maintain. Amara. He said her name the way he said everything. Like he had considered it first. Mr. Vale. He looked at the counter, at the small vase of white flowers she had moved 2 inches to the left because the morning light hit them better there. Said nothing about it. Took his coffee and left. That evening the vase was still in the same place she'd put it. Rosa told her things without meaning to. Not secrets. Rosa was loyal in the bone-deep way of someone who had watched a family survive things she would never speak aloud. But small things leaked through, the way warmth leaks through walls in winter. That Mr. Vale took his meals alone since his brother died 3 years ago. That he had not raised his voice inside this house in all the years Rosa had worked here. That he read in the library on nights when the city was particularly loud and came to breakfast quieter than usual, as though the books had given him something difficult to digest. Amara stored all of it. Told herself it was intelligence. Told herself that on the 6th night when she lay awake in her small room on the 3rd floor, reciting her father's name like a prayer to keep herself anchored, Marco Solari, the shipyard, the fire that was not an accident, and found that the recitation took slightly longer to steady her than it had the night before. On the 7th day she nearly found the ledger. A door she had assumed was a second linen cupboard turned out to be a narrow staircase to a lower office, half basement, the kind of room that existed on no floor plan she had been given. She had 3 minutes before Mrs. Holt's next round. She used 2 of them standing in the doorway, memorizing, the filing cabinet, the second desk, the safe bolted to the far wall with the quiet confidence of something that had never needed to prove itself. She used the 3rd minute closing the door softly and walking back down the corridor at the unhurried pace of a woman with nothing to hide. Her heart was striking the inside of her ribs like it wanted out. She had found the room. That was enough for today. She was good at patience. Her father had taught her that, in the long slow evenings when he'd come home from the shipyard smelling of salt water and honest work, sitting across from her at a kitchen table that was nothing like mahogany, saying the truth doesn't move, Amara. It waits. All you have to do is outlast the lie. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and breathed. She thought about the man in the kitchen with his coffee and his open collar and the weight he carried like it had always been his. She thought about a voice reading poetry to an empty room. She told herself it didn't matter. That none of it mattered. That she was the mouse, he was the lion, and the only thing separating her from the truth her father deserved was her ability to remember which one she was. She believed that. Almost entirely. She heard the car before she saw the headlights. It was past midnight, the house long settled into its nighttime breathing, Rosa gone home, Mrs. Holt retired to her quarters on the east wing, and Amara was in the library. Not cleaning. She had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that she came to the library at night to clean. She came because the books were the one part of this house that asked nothing of her, and because 3 hours of lying in the dark reciting her father's name had stopped being enough to fill the silence. She was at the window when the car pulled in too fast and stopped at an angle that wasn't quite right. She knew, before the door opened, that something was wrong. Men like Gideon Vale did not park carelessly. Control was a language he spoke in every gesture, the precise placement of a coffee cup, the considered weight of a single word. The car sitting crooked on the gravel at 12:14 in the morning was a sentence he would never have written willingly. He got out alone. That was the second thing. He always came home with at least one of them, Dario, or the younger one whose name she hadn't learned yet, silent men who moved like punctuation around Gideon's presence. Tonight there was no one. Just him, one hand pressed flat against the car door as he found his footing, his jacket dark in a way that had nothing to do with the color of the fabric. Amara was already moving before she had made the decision to move. She met him in the entrance hall. He looked up and she saw it cross his face, not embarrassment, nothing so soft as that. Something closer to the particular irritation of a man who has been caught at a disadvantage by precisely the person he would have chosen not to witness it. His hand was still pressed to his side. His shirt, beneath the jacket he hadn't bothered to button back up, was dark and wet and ruined. Go back to bed. His voice was even. Impressively, almost insultingly even. You're bleeding. I'm aware of that. Heavily. Also aware. She didn't move. Neither did he, for a moment, and in that moment something shifted in the entrance hall, some negotiation conducted entirely in silence, and then he exhaled once through his nose and moved toward the kitchen without another word, which she understood to mean she could follow. She followed. He sat at the kitchen table without being asked. She took that as a measure of how bad it was, that he had stopped arguing with the logistics of the situation and started simply managing them. He set his jacket on the back of the chair with a care that was almost fastidious, the habit of a man who maintained appearances as a matter of discipline regardless of circumstances. The shirt was worse than she had thought. She didn't let her face say so. She found the first aid kit where Rosa had shown her in the first week, third cabinet, lower shelf, behind the olive oil, and brought it to the table and opened it without ceremony. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. My father worked the shipyard. Men came home hurt. She didn't look up. It was either learn or watch. A silence. Which did you prefer? Learning. She met his eyes briefly. Watching felt too much like giving up. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. He looked away first. The wound was along his left side, a knife, she thought, drawn rather than thrust, which was the only reason this was a kitchen table situation and not a hospital one. Deep enough to have bled dramatically, not deep enough to have hit anything that couldn't heal. She cleaned it with the focus of someone who needed the task in order not to think about the proximity, about his breath evening out above her, about the fact that she was kneeling beside Gideon Vale in a midnight kitchen with her hands doing something gentle for a man she had come here to unmake. She was very careful not to think about any of that. He was very careful not to make a sound. You can, she said. Can what? React. It's just me. Another silence, this one with a different texture. That's a strange thing to say to your employer. You're not my employer right now. Right now you're just someone who needs stitches and is pretending he doesn't. He looked down at her then, from whatever distance the chair gave him over her, and she felt the full weight of his attention the way you feel a change in weather, before it arrives, in the pressure of the air. Are you always this direct? Only after midnight. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that had considered becoming one and then thought better of it. She had no suture kit, She made do with butterfly closures and told him so, and he nodded once as though approving a business decision. She worked in silence for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city hummed at its lowest frequency, the sound of a place that never fully slept, only rested with one eye open. "The Caruso family," he said eventually. Not explaining. Not asking for sympathy. Simply placing the information in the air between them the way you set something down you have been carrying too long. She didn't ask what that meant. She had heard the name, in Rosa's careful silences, in the tone Mrs. Holt used when she thought no one was listening. She filed it away and said nothing. "They'll try again," he added. Quiet. Certain. "I know." He looked at her sharply. She kept her eyes on her work. "I mean, men like that always do." She pressed the last closure flat. "There. You'll need a doctor in the morning. A real one. Probably." She began packing the kit away. Her hands were steady. She was proud of them for that. "Amara." She stilled. "Why are you awake at midnight?" The question was even, but it had edges. She had learned, in 8 days, that his questions always did, that he asked only what he genuinely wanted to know, and that the casual tone was not casualness but precision wearing a lighter coat. "The library," she said. Truthfully. "I couldn't sleep." He considered that. "Which book?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the name of the poem she had heard him reading through the wall on that first Tuesday, low and exact, as though confirming something he had suspected. She did not ask how he knew. He did not ask why she'd been close enough to the wall to hear. They let the question live between them in the warm midnight kitchen, unanswered and therefore safe, two people sitting across from each other with blood on the table and secrets they were both still holding, not yet willing to set down, not yet ready to name what it meant that neither of them had looked away. The message arrived on a Thursday, in the form of a flower. A single white lily, stem cleanly cut, placed on the front steps of the Vale estate sometime between the 4 a.m. security rotation and dawn. No note. No name. None was needed. Amara didn't know what it meant when she almost stepped on it at 6:15, on her way back from checking the post box at the end of the drive, a task Mrs. Holt had assigned her and which had the additional benefit of giving her 3 unobserved minutes outside the house each morning. She picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up something dropped, and carried it inside. She knew something was wrong when she set it on the kitchen counter and Rosa went completely still. The older woman's hand stopped moving over the breakfast tray. Her eyes went to the lily and stayed there for 2 full seconds, the kind of pause that contains an entire conversation, and then she took it from the counter, wrapped it in a cloth, and placed it in the bin under the sink without a word or an explanation. By 7 a.m. the security detail had doubled. By 8, Gideon had cancelled every appointment in his day. Amara learned what the lily meant from Dario, which was to say she learned it accidentally. He was standing in the corridor outside the study when she came through with fresh linens, and he was on the phone, and he was not particularly careful about who could hear him because she was, in his estimation and in the estimation of every man in this house, simply the maid. She had worked very hard to deserve that estimation. The Caruso family, Dario said to whoever was on the other end, had sent the same lily to 2 other addresses in the last 6 months. Both households had experienced what he called, with the flat economy of a man reporting weather, significant losses within a fortnight. Amara folded a pillowcase in the corridor and filed that away with everything else. She didn't see Gideon until noon. He found her, which was the more accurate version of events. She was on her knees in the east hallway, cleaning the baseboards, a task no one had assigned her and which she had invented to give herself legitimate access to the corridor outside the lower office, when she heard his footsteps and looked up to find him standing at the far end, watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was the expression he wore when he was calculating something, and the something was her. "I need you to stay inside today." He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, the assumption of compliance built into the architecture of the sentence. She sat back on her heels. I have the post run at 6. Someone else will do it. Mrs. Holt expects. Mrs. Holt answers to me. A pause. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his posture, not softening, nothing as simple as that, but a slight recalibration, the way a very controlled person adjusts when they notice they are being too much of themselves. There is a security matter. It affects the perimeter. I need all non-essential personnel to remain inside until it's resolved. Non-essential personnel. She let that sit for a moment. Of course, Mr. Vale. He held her gaze for a beat longer than the conversation required. Then he walked away, and she turned back to the baseboard, and she waited until his footsteps had fully receded before she allowed herself to consider what had just happened. He had come himself. With a house full of men whose entire function was the management and communication of exactly this kind of instruction, Gideon Vale had walked to the east hallway and delivered it in person. She pressed her cloth against the baseboard and told herself it meant nothing. It happened again at 3. She was in the kitchen, helping Rosa prepare the afternoon tray, when raised voices filtered through the door to the adjoining room, Dario's, and then Gideon's, lower and more controlled, which somehow made it worse. She caught fragments. The south gate. A car that had passed 3 times. The question of whether to move her. Rosa was watching her face. Amara kept it neutral with the discipline of someone who had practiced. He is not a man who worries easily, Rosa said quietly, not looking up from the tray. You should know that. I don't know what you mean. Rosa said nothing. Which was its own kind of answer. By evening the fracture had spread to the guards. She saw it in the way they looked at her when she moved through the house, not the usual calculated indifference, the professional invisibility they extended to household staff. Something more alert. More uncertain. Marco, the one who stood nights at the foot of the main staircase, actually stepped aside when she approached, as though she warranted the same courtesy extended to someone of consequence. She had done nothing to earn that. Gideon had done it for her, without appearing to do anything at all. A word here, a look there, the subtle reorientation of attention that a man at the center of a hierarchy produces simply by changing where his own attention rests. He had looked at her differently, and so his men had looked at her differently, and none of them, including him, she suspected, could have explained precisely when or why it had begun. She found him in the library at 9. He was standing at the window that overlooked the south garden, not reading, not working, simply standing with a glass of bourbon held loosely at his side. The lamp was low. The city beyond the glass was its usual restless self, all light and motion and the suggestion of violence kept just below the surface. She almost retreated. Should have retreated. The lily, she said instead, from the doorway. It was a warning. He didn't turn. Yes. For the house, or for someone in it? A pause. The bourbon glass turned once in his hand. Does it matter? It matters to me. He turned then, slowly, and looked at her across the library the way he had looked at her in the entrance hall on the night she'd found him bleeding, with that particular quality of attention that felt less like being seen and more like being known, which was considerably more frightening. You're safe, he said. Quiet. Certain. The voice of a man making a promise inside a statement of fact. You don't know that. No. He looked back at the window. But I know what happens to anyone who makes me doubt it. The room was very still. She understood then what had confused his guards, because it was beginning to confuse her too, this thing he was doing that looked like security protocol and was not quite security protocol, that wore the language of professional obligation and meant something else entirely underneath. Something he hadn't named yet. Something she suspected he was working very hard not to examine too closely. She should have felt afraid. She felt, instead, the particular and terrible warmth of being someone's exception, of being the thing a ruthless man had quietly, almost involuntarily, decided to protect. She said goodnight. He didn't answer, but he waited until her footsteps had faded down the corridor before he turned back to the window. She knew because she listened. She found the photograph at 11:17 on a Friday night. She wasn't supposed to be in the study. She was supposed to be in her room, in the small bed with its clean white sheets, performing the sleep of someone with nothing to hide. But the lower office had been left unlocked. She had checked at 10, and again at 10:45, unable to quite believe it, certain that the unlocked door was itself a kind of trap, and at 11 she had stopped arguing with the opportunity and simply walked through it. The filing cabinet was older than everything else in the room. That was the first thing. The rest of the lower office was precise and modern, everything serving a function, nothing decorative, but the cabinet was dark wood, scratched at the corners, the kind of object that had survived several versions of a life and been carried forward out of stubbornness or sentiment. She tried the top drawer first. Locked. The second. Locked. The third opened with a sound like a held breath finally released. She found correspondence. Financial records. The architecture of an empire rendered in paperwork. She moved through it carefully, her hands steady, her breathing measured, and she was 3 folders deep when she found the edge of something that was not a document. A photograph. Old enough to have softened at the corners, the colors slightly warm in the way of things developed before everything became digital and permanent. 3 people. A woman, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame, the laugh so genuine it had survived whatever had happened since. A boy of perhaps 7, all knees and seriousness, looking at the camera with eyes she recognized before she recognized anything else about the image. And Gideon. Young enough that the weight hadn't fully settled on him yet, standing with one hand on the boy's shoulder and looking not at the camera but at the woman, with an expression so unguarded, so privately tender, that Amara felt she had walked into a room she had no right to enter. She stood in the lower office at 11:17 on a Friday night, holding a photograph of a man she was supposed to be dismantling, and felt the first clean crack run through the certainty she had carried here like armor. She put it back exactly as she had found it. Closed the drawer. Left the room. She did not find the ledger. He was in the library when she came upstairs. She smelled the bourbon first, not heavily, just the warm suggestion of it, and then saw the lamplight under the door, and then she made the mistake of hesitating one beat too long in the corridor and he said, without raising his voice, "You don't have to stand in the hall." She opened the door. He was in the chair by the window, the one she had started to think of privately as his chair in the way you assign ownership to things people return to consistently. He had his jacket off, his collar open, the glass balanced on his knee. He looked like a man who had been sitting with his own thoughts for long enough that company, even unexpected company, was a relief he wouldn't admit to. "Couldn't sleep," she said. The same answer as before. True in the same way as before, partially, technically, in the manner of a statement that contains the truth without completing it. He looked at her for a moment. "You've been crying." She hadn't. She was quite sure of that. But something must have rearranged itself in her face downstairs in the lower office, some internal shift made briefly external, because he said it with the quiet certainty of someone reporting what they could see, not guessing. "I'm fine. I didn't ask." She crossed the room and sat, not in her usual place near the bookshelves but in the chair across from his, close enough that the lamplight reached them both. She didn't fully know why. Later she would tell herself it was tiredness, that she had been performing composure for 3 weeks and the photograph had spent something she hadn't budgeted for. "Tell me about your brother," she said. The silence that followed was the longest one she had produced in this house. He didn't ask how she knew he had one. Didn't ask what she'd been doing to learn it. He simply looked at her across the low lamplight for a long time, the bourbon untouched on his knee, and then he said, "Matteo," as though the name itself was the beginning and end of it. "Matteo," she repeated, gently. He was 7 years younger. Which meant I spent most of his childhood trying to keep him out of this. A pause. I failed at that. How? The way you fail at most things you care about. Slowly. And then all at once. He turned the glass in his hand. He died 3 years ago. A disagreement with the Caruso family that I was supposed to have resolved before it reached him. She said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only container large enough. My mother never recovered, he continued. She's in the house on the coast now. She doesn't, we don't, he stopped. Started again, differently. She looks at me and sees the version of events where I arrived 10 minutes earlier. Do you? The question sat between them, honest and undecorated. Every day, he said. She told him about her father without deciding to. That was the only way she could explain it afterward, not a choice but a consequence, the way one open window creates a draft that moves through the whole house. He had set something down in the room and it had shifted the air, and she had set something down too, before she had thought carefully enough about whether she should. The shipyard, she said. The fire. The official version, which was an accident, and the version she believed, which was not. She kept it brief. She kept it factual. She watched his face while she spoke and she saw something move through it that she couldn't quite name, not surprise, something more internal than that, a reaction directed inward rather than at her. She noticed that. Filed it away in the part of herself that hadn't stopped working, that was always working, even here in the midnight library with his grief in the air between them and her own grief finally given the small mercy of being spoken aloud. When she finished he was quiet for a long time. I'm sorry, he said finally. About your father. 2 words that were also something else. She felt them land differently than condolences usually did, heavier, and more specific, as though they were weighted with a knowledge he wasn't yet sharing. As though he was sorry in a way that went slightly further than the story she had told him. She almost asked. Didn't. It was a long time ago, she said instead. Grief doesn't observe calendars. He said it simply, from experience. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself, the way she had been carefully not doing for 4 weeks, and she saw the full weight of him. Not the empire. Not the danger. Just the man underneath it all, carrying his losses the way Atlas carried the world. Quietly. Without putting them down. The lamp burned low between them. Neither of them moved to leave. Outside the city went on being the city, restless and indifferent and lit up against the dark, and inside the library 2 people sat across from each other with the particular stillness of those who have said true things and are now living in the aftermath, in the tender and terrifying space where honesty has been and cannot be taken back. She had come here for a ledger. She was leaving with something far more dangerous. The knowledge that the man she needed to destroy was the first person in a very long time who had looked at her grief and recognized it, because he was fluent in it himself. He left the envelope on her bed. She found it at 7 in the morning, pristine white, her name written on the front in his handwriting, which she recognized now the way you recognize a voice in a crowd, by its particular quality rather than any single feature. Precise. Unhurried. The writing of a man who considered even small gestures worth doing correctly. Inside was a single folded sheet, and inside that, more money than she had agreed to work for in 3 months. No letter. No explanation. Just the money, and below it, in that same careful hand, your employment is terminated, effective today. A car will collect you at 9. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the sheet of paper held loosely in her hands, and she was aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that she should go. Every rational calculation she possessed, every instinct sharpened by 5 weeks of careful navigation, said take the money, take the car, come back for the ledger another way. The second was that she was not going to do that, and that she had known it before she had finished reading the note, and that the reason had become considerably more complicated than the ledger. She folded the paper. put it back in the envelope. Went downstairs to find him. He was in the study, standing at his desk, and he knew before she reached the doorway because he looked up at exactly the moment she appeared in it, as though he had been listening for her footsteps with the particular attention of someone expecting an argument. She set the envelope on his desk. He looked at it. Looked at her. The car comes at 9. I'm not getting in it. Amara. Whatever is happening, she said, whatever the Caruso family is planning, firing me doesn't change whether I'm in danger. It just changes whether I'm here. She held his gaze. And I'd rather be here. Something moved through his face at that, fast, quickly controlled, but she had become fluent enough in his expressions to catch it before it was gone. It was not irritation. It was something that looked considerably more like the thing he had been trying not to feel for 5 weeks, surfacing briefly before he pushed it back under. You don't understand what's coming, he said. Quiet. Controlled. The voice he used when the alternative was something rawer. Then tell me. No. Gideon. His name. Not Mr. Vale, not the careful professional distance she had maintained for 5 weeks. His name, simply, the way you say the name of someone you have sat with in a midnight library and told true things to, and the room changed the moment she said it, contracted slightly, the air between them becoming something different in quality and density. He looked at her as though she had done something he hadn't given her permission to do. She supposed she had. There will be a move against this house, he said finally. Within the week. We have intelligence, partial, not enough to stop it, enough to know it's coming. He came around the desk, not toward her, to the window, putting glass and city between himself and the conversation. I won't have you here when it happens. And Rosa? Mrs. Holt? Already arranged. They leave tomorrow, family visits, nothing that looks like evacuation. He turned slightly. You were supposed to be simpler. Was I? You were supposed to take the money and go. He looked at her fully then, across the width of the study, and she felt it, the full, unguarded weight of him that he usually kept behind 3 layers of composure. Why won't you? The question was genuine. That was the thing about Gideon Vale, even now, even here, standing at the window with an empire under threat and 5 weeks of careful not feeling pulled thin as paper, he asked only what he genuinely wanted to know. She should have given him a tactical answer. Something that preserved the story she had come here with. Instead she said, because you wouldn't leave. If it were me in this house and you at the door with a car at 9, you wouldn't get in it. The silence was long enough to be its own kind of answer. That's different, he said. How? He didn't answer that. Which was the only answer that mattered. She crossed the room. She wasn't entirely sure when she decided to, or whether decide was even the right word. It felt less like a decision and more like something that had been building since a midnight kitchen and a photograph in a lower office and a library where 2 people had said true things and were still living in the reverb of them. She stopped close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze, close enough that the distance between them was no longer professional in any interpretation. His jaw tightened. The only sign. You should go, he said. Low. The words doing work they weren't designed for, carrying the weight of everything he wasn't saying underneath them. You keep saying that. You keep not listening. Because you don't mean it. She held his gaze. You didn't mean it the first time you said it. You don't mean it now. Something shifted in him, not breaking, nothing so dramatic, but a loosening of the outermost layer of control. The way a knot doesn't come undone all at once but goes slack in one place and you feel the whole structure change. His eyes moved across her face the way they had in the kitchen, in the library, in the corridor outside the east hallway, slowly, deliberately, as though he was memorizing something he had told himself he wasn't allowed to keep. Amara. Her name in his mouth had always been careful. Now it was careful in a different way. The carefulness of someone holding something they are afraid to grip too tightly. I'm not leaving, she said quietly. So you can stop trying to make me. He reached up slowly and she went completely still, and he did nothing more than take the envelope from where she had set it on the desk beside her and place it in her hand and close her fingers around it one by one, his hand over hers, warm and deliberate and devastating in its restraint. Keep it, he said. Whatever happens. His hand stayed over hers for 3 seconds. She counted them because she needed something to do that wasn't look at his mouth. Then he stepped back. Put the distance between them again. Picked up the phone on his desk with the practiced ease of a man returning to the version of himself that ran an empire, as though the last 10 minutes had not happened, as though the air in the room wasn't still rearranged from it. You'll move to the interior rooms, he said. Back to the even tone. The controlled distance. Almost convincing. Away from the street-facing windows. And you'll do exactly what Dario tells you, when he tells you. And you? He looked up from the phone. One look, brief and complete and full of everything he still wasn't saying. I'll be fine. She wanted to tell him that she knew what it sounded like when he said things he wasn't certain of. That she had learned, over 5 weeks, the specific quality of his certainty versus his resolve, and that what she had just heard was the latter, which was a different animal entirely. She said nothing. Took the envelope. Went to the interior rooms. And lay in the dark counting the hours until morning with his hand still warm over hers in the place where memory lives, which is somewhere below thought and considerably harder to evict. It started with the lights. Not a power cut, nothing so innocent as that. The estate's external lighting died in sequence, east to west, deliberately, the way you extinguish candles when you know exactly where you're going in the dark. Amara was in the interior room Gideon had assigned her, sitting on the edge of the bed fully dressed because she had not been able to make herself do otherwise, and she felt the darkness change before she saw it, a shift in the quality of the silence, the way the house held itself differently when something outside it had changed. She was at the door before the first sound reached her. It came from the south, a percussion, compressed and flat, the sound of controlled force applied to something solid. Not an explosion. A breach. She had heard that sound twice in her life, both times at the shipyard, both times in the months before her father died, when men with particular expertise had been testing the limits of particular structures. She knew what it meant. Someone was coming in, and they had come prepared. The radio on the bedside table crackled. Dario's voice, stripped to function. All positions. South gate is down. We have 4, maybe 5. Interior team hold the principal. The principal. Gideon. She was already moving. The corridor was dark in the way of places that a forgotten light ever existed. She moved through it with her hand along the wall, not running, because running in darkness is how you announce yourself, and she had learned a long time ago, not from her father, from the year after him, from the cold education of being a woman alone with a purpose and no protection, that silence is the only currency that doesn't devalue under pressure. She took the back staircase. The one the household staff used, narrow and uncarpeted, that none of Gideon's men thought to account for because they had never had to think about the architecture of invisibility. She reached the ground floor as the second breach happened. Closer this time. The east corridor. She found Dario first, which was fortunate. He was at the junction of the main hall and the east corridor, 2 of the other men flanking him, all of them oriented toward the sound. He turned when he heard her and his face did what faces do when the wrong person appears in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Get back upstairs. How many inside? I said get. Dario. She kept her voice low and even. How many are already inside the house? A beat. The sound of something moving at the far end of the east corridor. His eyes went there and came back to her. 2 that we know of. Maybe 3. Where is he? Study. Marco's with him. 1 man. He's enough. The shot that came from the east corridor ended that sentence and started something else entirely. Not at them, past them, high, a warning or a miss, it didn't matter which. Dario moved toward it with his men and Amara moved in the opposite direction, toward the study, and she heard him shout her name behind her and kept going. The study door was closed. She didn't knock, pressed herself against the wall beside it, listened, heard two voices inside and recognized neither of them as Gideon's or Marco's, and that was all the information she needed. She tried the handle. Unlocked. She opened it fast and low and took the room in the way she had trained herself to take rooms, in sections, left to right, threat assessment before anything else. Marco was on the floor by the window, conscious, one hand pressed to his shoulder. Two men stood between her and the desk. At the desk, standing with the particular stillness of someone who has calculated every available option and found them all inadequate, was Gideon. He saw her. His expression did something she had no time to interpret. The closer of the two men turned toward her, and she did not give him the full rotation. She moved before he completed it, inside his reach, not away from it, which was the thing that most people got wrong, the thing she had spent a year learning to get right, and what happened next took 4 seconds and left him on the floor and her with his weapon and the whole room rearranged around a new set of facts. The second man recalculated. Looked at her. Looked at the gun. Made the intelligent decision, which was the door, and she let him take it because Dario's men were in the corridor and that was no longer her problem. She straightened. The room was very quiet. Marco said something from the floor. She crossed to him, checked the shoulder, clean, she thought, through and through, he would live, and applied pressure with the cloth from the desk in the way she had applied pressure to Gideon's side 6 weeks ago, in a midnight kitchen that felt like another country now. Gideon had not moved. She could feel him watching her. Could feel the quality of it, not the warmth she had become reluctantly accustomed to, not the careful, controlled attention of a man managing something he refused to name. This was different. This was the focused, precise regard of a man reassembling a picture he thought he understood and finding the pieces no longer fit. She finished with Marco and stood and met his eyes. You need to call someone for his shoulder, she said. Amara. His voice was even. Dangerously even. Where did you learn to do that? Not a question. The shape of one, the punctuation of one, but not one. My father. No. Quiet. Absolute. That is not something a shipyard worker's daughter learns. That is not something you learn. That is something you are taught, carefully, by people with a specific reason to teach it. The room held its breath. She kept her face still with the effort of someone who had practiced keeping it still, and she looked at him across the dark study with the body of an unconscious man between them and the sounds of Dario's men clearing the corridor outside. And she understood that the carefully constructed architecture of the last 6 weeks had developed a crack that no amount of careful living was going to repair. Marco needs a doctor, she said. He'll get one. Gideon took one step toward her. Just one. Who are you? She said nothing. I have been patient, he said softly. With the questions I haven't asked. With the things that didn't quite add up. The late nights. The rooms you found too easily. The way you moved through this house like you already knew its shape before you arrived. Another step. I have been, he paused, and she heard in the pause everything the patience had cost him, extraordinarily patient, Amara. I need you to understand that before you decide what to tell me next. She looked at him. At the man who had read poetry to an empty room. Who had sat across from her in a midnight library and said his brother's name like it was the truest thing he owned. Who had placed her hand in both of his and told her to keep the money and meant something else entirely. She thought about the ledger. About her father. About the photograph in the lower office, the woman laughing, the boy with his eyes, the version of Gideon Vale that existed before the weight had found him. She thought about the fact that she had just crossed a dark room toward danger instead of away from it, and that somewhere between the decision and the doing she had stopped thinking about the ledger entirely. "My name is Amara Solari," she said. She watched him absorb the surname. Watched the moment it landed, the almost imperceptible stillness, the faint rearrangement behind his eyes of someone for whom that name is not new information but a new context for existing information. "Solari," he said. "Yes." The corridor outside had gone quiet. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed. Gideon looked at her for a long time, in the way he looked at things he was deciding what to do with, fully, without blinking, with the total attention of a man who had survived this long by reading situations correctly and acting before anyone else had finished thinking. Then he said, very quietly, "Sit down." She sat. Not because he told her to. She had stopped doing things purely because Gideon Vale told her to somewhere around the third week, though she had been careful not to let him notice. She sat because her legs had decided, quietly and without consulting the rest of her, that they had done enough for one evening. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon. Set one in front of her. Took the other to the window and stood with his back to her for long enough that she understood it was not rudeness but necessity, that he needed the city between them while he organized what he knew into what it meant. She waited. She was good at waiting. Her father had taught her that, and grief had reinforced it, and 6 weeks in this house had refined it into something close to an art form. When he turned, his face was composed in the way of someone who has finished feeling something and is now prepared to work with the facts. "Marco Solari," he said. "The shipyard fire. 18 months ago." 22 months, she said. "And 3 days. Something moved through his expression at that. Not guilt, not yet, something more preliminary. The look of a man who has been handed a mirror and is taking his first honest look. "You came here for the ledger." "Yes. The one in the lower office safe." She held very still. "You knew about the lower office." "I know everything that happens in this house." He said it without pride, simply as a statement of operational fact. "I knew about the door the second week. I've been waiting to see what you would do." He paused. "You were more patient than I expected." The ground she had thought she was standing on rearranged itself beneath her. She sat with the sensation of it, the vertiginous understanding that she had believed herself the one doing the watching, and he had been watching her watching, and the careful architecture of her infiltration had been, to some degree, a room he had allowed her to build. "Then why?" she started. "Because I wanted to know why." He crossed to the desk and sat on the edge of it, close enough that the lamplight reached them both. "Not who I could have found in 24 hours. Why? What you were willing to do. How far you would go." A pause. "Whether you were working alone." "I am. I know that now." His eyes held hers. "You would not have come into that room tonight if there was anyone else. You would have let someone more expendable take the risk." She didn't answer, because the answer was yes, and they both knew it, and saying so felt like handing him something. "The ledger," she said instead. "It has the contracts. The payments. Proof that the fire was ordered." "Yes." The single syllable hit her like cold water. Not the confirmation. She had built her entire life for 22 months and 3 days around the certainty of what the ledger contained, but the absence of surprise in it. The way he said it, level and undeflecting, as though she had stated a fact he had long since made his peace with. "You knew," she said slowly. "You knew what was in it." "I know what's in everything in that safe." He looked at her steadily. "That's why it's in a safe." "And the fire." "You knew." "I knew after." His voice changed on that, not breaking. Gideon Vale did not break, but acquiring a density it hadn't carried before. "I want to be precise about that, Amara, because it matters and because you deserve precision. The order for the shipyard came from within the Caruso family. It came through a contract intermediary. It was presented to me as a legitimate acquisition dispute with casualties that were, he stopped. Something worked in his jaw. That were described to me as unavoidable. I signed off on the acquisition. Not on the fire. Not on the people inside it. She stared at him. When I found out what had actually happened, the intermediary had a very brief and definitive career thereafter. His eyes didn't leave hers. The ledger exists because I built a case. Evidence that the Carusas ordered the fire independently, used my acquisition as cover, and have been leveraging my implicit involvement ever since as insurance against my moving against them. The study was profoundly quiet. You've been building a case against them, she said. For 16 months. While they've been sending lilies to your front steps. Mutually assured destruction is only useful until one party decides they have less to lose than the other. He looked at her steadily. They've been escalating because they know the case is nearly complete. Last week was confirmation, not aggression. She sat with all of it. Let it move through her the way the truth moves when it is larger than the shape you built to hold it, displacing things, requiring rearrangement, insisting on space you hadn't allocated. Her father had been inside a fire ordered by the Carusas. Gideon had not ordered it. She had spent 22 months and 3 days building her grief into a weapon pointed at the wrong man. The ledger, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. I still need it. I know. Not to use against you. If what you're saying is. I'll give it to you. She stopped. Not tonight. And not alone. If you walk out of here with it and the Carusas find out before I'm ready to move, it becomes a liability instead of a weapon. He studied her. But I'll give it to you. All of it. Every page. On one condition. She waited. You help me finish this. He stood from the desk, and he was very close now, close in the way he had been in the study the morning she'd refused to leave, close in the way that had stopped being accidental several weeks ago. You know things I don't. How the Carusas use intermediaries, how they structure payments for contract work. Your father documented it, I know he did, because the gaps in my ledger correspond exactly to the kind of information a careful man with access to shipyard contracts would have recorded before someone decided he'd recorded enough. Her breath caught. You know about his records. I suspected. Now I'm certain. His eyes were steady on hers. I've been fighting this on my own for 16 months. I'm very good at fighting on my own. But I've been running out of time, and the Carusas know it, and what happened tonight in this room. His gaze moved briefly to the floor where the man she'd put there was no longer in evidence. Dario, having managed that with quiet efficiency, suggests that I have been undervaluing what you bring to this. She looked at him. At the full, complicated truth of him, the man who ran an empire and read Neruda on Tuesday afternoons, who had carried his brother's name for 3 years like penance, who had sat in a midnight library and listened to her grief with the attention of someone who understood it from the inside. Who had known who she was for weeks and kept pouring the bourbon anyway. A partnership, she said. Yes. You and the maid. Something shifted in his face then, the corner of his mouth, and beneath it something warmer, something that had been accumulating for 6 weeks and was only now being allowed a small, partial expression. You were never just the maid, he said quietly. We both know that. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the city pulsed on, indifferent and relentless, full of people who would never know that in a study on the 14th floor of the Vale estate, a woman who had arrived to destroy a man was sitting across from him considering the precise terms of an entirely different arrangement. I want full access to the ledger, she said. Every page. Yes. And when this is over, the Carusas, the case, all of it, my father's name is cleared. Publicly. On record. That was always going to happen. He said it simply, as though it had been decided long before tonight. Whether or not you asked. She absorbed that. Extended her hand. He looked at it, and then he took it, and his grip was firm and warm and he held it a beat longer than a handshake requires, his thumb resting briefly against her wrist in a way that was not quite professional and made no pretense of being. "One more condition," she said, not releasing his hand. He waited. "Tell me about Mateo. The real version. Not the one you've been carrying alone." His hand stilled in hers. The composure moved, not breaking, but thinning, the outermost layer of it going briefly translucent in the lamplight. "That," he said after a long moment, very quietly, "is not a condition. That is," he paused, and she heard in the pause the particular sound of a door that has been closed for a long time beginning, slowly, to open, "something I might need to work up to." "I know," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived in this house, Gideon Vale looked at her without any layer between the looking and the feeling, and what she saw there was not the empire, not the danger, not the weight of everything he carried. Just a man, holding her hand in a lamplit room, deciding, perhaps for the first time in years, that he did not have to let go. The dress arrived on a Saturday morning in a black box with no card. She knew it was from him because of the precision, the way it had been chosen not for spectacle but for fit, as though someone had measured not just her body but the particular quality of how she carried herself, the way she occupied space, the specific manner in which she stood when she thought no one was watching. Deep emerald, floor length, the fabric heavy enough to move with authority rather than flutter. No embellishment. No apology. The kind of dress that understood exactly what it was. She stood in her room, the interior room she had been moved to, which had gradually, over the 2 weeks since the attack, accrued small evidences of permanence, her books on the shelf, her father's photograph on the bedside table, and held it for a long moment before she put it on. She thought about her father. About the shipyard. About the ledger now open on the desk in the lower office, all its careful pages spread between her and Gideon in the evenings like a map of a country they were learning together. About how none of that had disappeared simply because she was going to put on a beautiful dress and walk into a room full of dangerous people beside a man who made her forget, with increasing frequency and decreasing guilt, why she had come here. Then she put it on. He was waiting at the foot of the stairs. She had expected someone to be Dario, or one of the others, the operational machinery of the evening arranged around her like a protocol. She had not expected Gideon himself, standing at the bottom of the staircase in a dark suit that had clearly been made for him by someone who understood that the architecture of a man's shoulders tells you everything about how he intends to be perceived. No ostentation. Nothing that needed to announce itself. The suit of a man who knew that the most dangerous thing in any room is the one that doesn't need to prove it. He watched her come down the stairs. He did not look away, and he did not pretend to, and the look itself was so complete and undeflected that she felt it differently than she had felt his attention before, not the careful, controlled regard of a man managing something, but the simple, honest looking of someone who has stopped pretending he isn't. "The box had no card," she said, when she reached the bottom. "No," he agreed. "You might have asked. You might have said no." "I might have," she allowed. "You'll never know." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked out into the waiting car, and the city received them. The Aldrich Foundation Gala occupied the top 3 floors of a building that had been built with the specific intention of making people feel small in ways they would interpret as feeling important. Crystal and candlelight, the kind of music designed to be present without being heard. 300 people an evening were conducting the elaborate social performance of people who have too much power to need to perform it, and yet do. She had been in rooms like this before. Not as a guest, as the daughter of a man who had worked the infrastructure that kept buildings like this standing, who had come home with salt in his hair and calluses on his hands and the particular dignity of someone who knew exactly what he was worth, which had nothing to do with what rooms like this decided to value. She kept that thought close as they entered. Wore it like a second skin beneath the emerald. Gideon moved through the room the way water moves through rock, not forcing, not deflecting, simply and inevitably finding the path that everything else accommodated. She stayed beside him and watched how the room rearranged itself around his presence, the small recalibrations, the strategic approaches, the careful distances maintained by people who wanted his regard and were managing their want with varying degrees of success. She watched who watched him back. That was the work tonight. Not the dress, not the arm, not the elaborate social architecture of their entrance together, which had produced, she noted, a particular quality of attention from certain corners of the room, the sharp recalibration of people who had filed Gideon Vale under one set of assumptions and were now quietly revising. The work was the faces. Who looked when they shouldn't? Who looked away too quickly? Who smiled with the wrong muscles? They had spent 3 evenings over the ledger identifying the most likely candidates for the mole, the person inside Gideon's organization who had been feeding information to the Carusos, who had made last week's attack possible, who had known the security rotation and the timing and the entry points with a specificity that only came from inside. 3 names had survived every round of elimination. One of them was in this room. She was almost certain she knew which one. His name was Vincent Hale, and he ran the Eastern logistics for the Vale Syndicate, and she had noticed him from the doorway because of the way he didn't look at Gideon. Everyone in this room looked at Gideon, with want or fear or the careful neutrality of people who had learned to manage both. Vincent Hale looked at the middle distance and held his champagne slightly too tightly and had the specific stillness of a man performing calm rather than experiencing it. She had seen that stillness before. In a mirror, for most of the 6 weeks she had spent in this house. She said nothing yet. Let the evening develop. They separated twice, both times by design, both times brief, Gideon moving through the room's outer orbit while she took the interior. She spoke to a woman who ran the city's largest import concern and was therefore useful and probably compromised. She spoke to 2 men from the Aldrich Foundation itself, whose legitimate philanthropy was the architecture behind which 3 separate Caruso front companies operated. She gathered information the way she had always gathered it, quietly, through the margins, asking the questions that sounded like other questions. Gideon found her at the window at 10:15. "Vincent," she said, without preamble, not turning from the glass. He was quiet for a moment. Then, beside her, in a voice that had not a single inflection of surprise, "Yes. You knew." "I suspected. For about 6 days." He came to stand beside her at the window, their reflections overlaid on the city below. "I needed to be certain. And now? Now I'm certain." He turned slightly toward her. "How did you know?" "He doesn't look at you." She met his eyes in the reflection. "Everyone in this room looks at you, Gideon. He has spent the entire evening looking at everything else. That's not deference. That's guilt wearing the costume of deference." He looked at her reflection for a long moment. The candlelight found the angles of his face the way it always found the things worth finding. "When we leave," he said, "Dario will manage Vincent." "I know. It will not be comfortable for Vincent." "I know that too." A pause. The music shifted below them, something slower, and the room shifted with it. "Dance with me," he said. She turned from the window. Looked at him, the full, present, unguarded version of him that she had been collecting in fragments since a midnight kitchen and a borrowed uniform and a grief that had led her, by the most circuitous possible route, here. "Is that an order, Mr. Vale?" "No." His hand came up, open, offered. "It is the first thing I have asked you for." She looked at his hand. Thought about everything it had taken to reach this room, this moment, this particular configuration of loss and discovery and something still becoming itself that she did not have a precise word for yet but recognized the shape of. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor, and the city blazed below them through 100 windows, and they moved together with the particular ease of 2 people who have learned the rhythm of each other in darker rooms than this, and she thought that her father would have found the whole thing either very funny or very beautiful, and decided that knowing him, it would have been both. Vincent Hale left the gala at 10:47. Dario was waiting. And in the middle of the floor, surrounded by crystal and candlelight and 300 people conducting the performance of power, Gideon Vale held Amara Solari as though she were not a maid or a mission or a mistake, but the one thing in his considerable empire he had not known he was missing until she walked into his study with a duster in her hand and secrets in her eyes and made him forget, for one unguarded moment, to be afraid of nothing. Vincent Hale confessed on a Sunday. She wasn't in the room for it. That was Gideon's decision and she hadn't argued with it, not because she deferred to him, they had moved well past the architecture of deference, but because she understood the distinction he was drawing. There were parts of his world that she would enter fully, and parts that he was still deciding how much of to let her see, and she respected the carefulness of that, the way he was building her access the same way he built everything, with deliberation, without waste. Dario told her afterward, in the kitchen, with the economy of a man who had revised his opinion of her sometime around the night she'd crossed a dark room toward danger and hadn't mentioned it since. Vincent had been feeding information to the Carusas for 11 months. Not for money, which would have been simpler and more forgivable in the cold arithmetic of betrayal, but for protection. His daughter, Dario said. The Carusas had found her first and made the calculation that she was worth more as leverage than as herself. Vincent had been paying the only currency he had. Amara sat with that for a long time after Dario left the kitchen. Sat with the particular difficulty of it, a man who had done a terrible thing for a reason she understood in her bones, the specific gravity of a parent's love weaponized by people who had long since stopped finding such gravity remarkable. She thought about her father, who had documented everything and said nothing and gone to work every day at a shipyard where the ground had already been prepared beneath him, and she understood that the line between Vincent Hale and Marco Solari was thinner than she had built her grief to accommodate. She was still sitting there when Gideon came in. He looked tired in the particular way she had learned to read, not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but of one who had been required to do something that cost him and had paid it without flinching because flinching was not available to him as an option. He sat across from her. Said nothing for a moment. Rosa had left coffee on the stove. She always left coffee, as though she understood that the kitchen was where the true business of this house had always been conducted, and he poured 2 cups and set one in front of Amara without asking. His daughter, she said. Safe. Already. He wrapped both hands around his cup in the way she had first seen him do, on a morning that felt like a different life. That was the first thing. She looked at him. Whatever else, he said quietly, she didn't choose this. And she was 17. He met her eyes. Some things are not negotiable, regardless of what her father did. She absorbed that. Added it to the long, accumulated ledger of him, the one she had been building without meaning to since a Tuesday afternoon and a voice reading poetry through a wall. And Vincent? Gone. Not, he paused, and she understood the pause, understood what it cost him to make the distinction and that the distinction was real. He's gone from the city. His family with him. There are places a man can go when Gideon Vale decides that the debt has a different form of payment than the obvious one. She said nothing. Felt the thing she had been feeling for weeks, that complex, inconvenient, unbudgeted feeling, move through her with less resistance than before. As though it had finally found the room it had been looking for. The Caruso case went to the authorities on a Tuesday. Not the police. Gideon had spent 16 months ensuring it went somewhere the Carusas couldn't reach, to people whose structural interest in the outcome aligned precisely with the evidence provided. The ledger. Her father's records, which she had retrieved from the place he had hidden them, a waterproof case in the foundation of a storage unit he had paid 3 years in advance as though some part of him had known he was preparing for an absence. The intermediary contracts. The financial architecture of a fire that had been called an accident for 22 months and 3 days. She sat in a room on the 14th floor with Gideon beside her and watched the case leave his hands and enter the machinery of consequence, and she felt her father's name settle into something, not closure. She had learned enough by now to distrust that word, but something sturdier and less provisional. Justice, moving at its own pace, which was slower than grief and more reliable. Afterward Gideon didn't say anything. He simply placed his hand over hers on the table, in the way he had once placed it over the envelope, deliberate, warm, saying the thing that words in his vocabulary hadn't yet fully caught up to. She turned her hand over and held his. The city changed around them over the following weeks in the way cities change when a power that has been pressing on them from one side is removed, not dramatically, not overnight, but in accumulations. The Caruso family's operations collapsed inward like a building with its foundation pulled. The Eastern logistics restructured. The men who had operated under the particular insurance of Caruso Protection discovered that the insurance had lapsed. Amara was in the study when the calls came in. Not at the door, not in the corridor, not performing invisibility with a duster in her hand, at the desk, across from Gideon, with the restructured ledger open between them and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She had opinions about the Eastern logistics. He had started asking for them with the naturalness of a man who has reorganized his understanding of a situation and is moving forward from the new coordinates. Dario had stopped being surprised. That had taken about a week. Mrs. Holt had never been surprised, which Amara suspected said something profound about Mrs. Holt. Rosa simply made enough coffee for two and said nothing, which was the highest form of approval available in Rosa's considerable repertoire. It was a Thursday evening when he said it. They were in the library, his chair, her chair, the lamp low between them, the city doing its usual restless thing beyond the glass. She was reading. He had been reading and had stopped, and she had felt him stop the way she felt most things he did now, in the peripheral awareness that had developed between them like a sixth sense calibrated specifically to him. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen on a kitchen morning in an open collar, the one he wore when he thought he was alone and the weight had briefly shifted and the man underneath the empire was briefly visible. Except he knew she was here. He was letting her see it on purpose. "You distract me," he said. The word she had first heard as a verdict. As a warning dressed in the language of control, spoken by a man who had reached for the wrong word because the right one hadn't been available to him yet. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I find," he paused, and in the pause she heard the door that had been opening since a confession in a lamplit study, swinging the rest of the way, "that I no longer consider that a problem." She set her book down. Looked at him across the low light, this man who had read her grief and matched it with his own, who had known who she was and left the library door open anyway, who had placed her hand in his on a dance floor and held it as though it were something he intended to keep. "Good," she said quietly. "Because I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, unhurried regard of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Then he stood, crossed the small distance between the two chairs, the distance that had been shrinking for 9 weeks in increments so deliberate they had felt almost inevitable, and he sat beside her, and he took the book from her hands and set it aside, and when he looked at her again there was nothing between the looking and the feeling. No empire. No distance. No word being used to carry the weight of another word. Just him. "Amara," he said. Simply. "The way you say the name of something you have decided is yours." She answered the only way that made sense. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the sharp, angular jaw carved out of something expensive, the face that had been her enemy and her study and her education and her undoing, and she felt him go still beneath her touch the way he went still at moments of high consequence, and she said, "I know, Gideon. I know." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them she was still there. She would, it turned out, keep being there. The distraction had become the Empire's greatest asset. Not despite who she was, because of it. Because she had arrived with a duster and a grief and a purpose, and somewhere between the midnight kitchens and the lamplit libraries and the long evenings over an open ledger she had built something she hadn't come here to build. Something that had no entry in any ledger and no place in any case file and no name in the vocabulary of a man who had run an empire on certainty. Something that was, it turned out, considerably more powerful than either of them. The city blazed beyond the library window. The lion and the mouse, neither one any longer what they had been. Both of them, finally, exactly where they were supposed to be. And just like that, the ledger is closed. The truth is out. The distraction has become the empire. But a man like Gideon Vale doesn't stop at one war won. And a woman like Amara Solari didn't come this far to stand still. Their story has only just begun to show what it's made of. If this world held you, if you felt the bourbon and the darkness and the weight of everything two people refused to say out loud until the midnight kitchen made them, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be found by the people who need them. Subscribe to your channel name. Because this is one room in a house full of them, and behind every door is a world that will keep you up past your bedtime and ruin every plan you made for tomorrow morning. And drop a comment below. Tell me, were you on Amara's side from the moment she didn't get in the car? Or did Gideon have you from the poetry? Because I genuinely need to know which one of them broke you first. The vault is open. The next story is waiting. Don't miss it.